You got one you came in? Okay, excellent. Psalm 119 is at the top of it. We're going to read that in just a few minutes. Tonight we're going to try to break a little ground. I have been blessed with some new tools for my craft here, so we're going to try them out. You notice there's no whiteboard up here. So we're going to see how it goes. I'm going to take over our... Now, the only thing I know about this so far, it works, but there's a little delay between when I write, okay? So if I say hi, did it say hi up there?
Hi.
Okay, there you go. All right, so all right. We'll see how it goes, but instead of the whiteboard, we'll be able to use this. It also adds me the opportunity to do other things, interact with PowerPoints, pull texts up, and maybe interact with the texts themselves. We are a little ways on the learning curve from Aaron being able to do that yet. This thing has been, I've been fiddling with this for a little over 24 hours, and it's less than 24 hours because at about 8:30, about 9 o'clock, 9:30 last night, I was going, y'all, check this out. Abigail, come show me how to do this. Because I don't know. She's like, Dad, you got to do this. Like, she's never owned one of these. It's intuitive to this generation. That's what they've grown up knowing. Like some of y'all, you just knew how to pull a carburetor apart and put it back together because that's just what you grew up doing. Well, this generation, it's how, Wi-Fi's and Bluetooths and this, that work out. I don't know. But anyhow, I am going to do my best. I used to be somewhat tech savvy. I am no longer tech savvy. I am one of those who has to call for my kids. So, wow, what a day. What a weird, awful, and yet a day to remember what a great country we have, and yet how much work there is to be done for the gospel and for good principles. I'm not going to descend into politics in any way, but I can guarantee you by the time we're done, we have to touch it because we're talking about something that is eminently political tonight. We circle back over to the English Reformation because we're going to get ourselves set up to come into the modern era. We're not going to spend a lot of time basically from the start or really from the 17th century all the way up into our modern day. There's not a lot of massive changes the way that we've taken on for the bulk of this period of church history. We've stopped at the major landmarks. There's some landmarks, we'll see them. No doubt about it. We did around the turn of the 20th century, so 19th going into the 20th century, there were some major shifts that have grown and developed, of which we are the inheritors. My dad's going to speak to that for a couple of weeks, and then I've got a brother-in-law who was in the Pentecostal movement, grew up in the Pentecostal movement, watched that firsthand, and just by conviction removed himself out of that. And he's done a lot of work in the history of it personally. I want him to share that with us because that's been one of the most widespread and influential movements that we are dealing with now. And it's quite a mixed bag, and it goes all over the spectrum, and it's almost hard to deal with. He's done a lot of work. I'm going to let him handle it. I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3 is the account of the three Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nebuchadnezzar erects his great idol, commands everyone to bow down to it. Strike up the band, and everybody bow down. And these three men do not do it. They're told on. This king. There's men that aren't bowing down. And so look at verse number 10. O king, you've made a declaration, a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer. By the way, I've heard some compelling preaching on the problem with the sackbut. Okay? Anyway, get all kinds of stuff when you get into some of these. But anyway, it wasn't very good, but it was compelling. Okay? By the end of it, I didn't like the sackbut either, but I had no reason to dislike it. But that's not the point of this. All kinds of music. They've said they'll fall down, they'll worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, he should be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Nebuchadnezzar gets mad. Okay? Verse 15, look at the very bottom. Verse 15 is a big long verse. Who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hand? He asks Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. when he confronts them in person. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. We're not pausing to measure our words, make sure we don't come off incorrectly. We're not really anxious about how we might sound. We're telling you flat out, if it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known. Be it known to thee, O king, we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Now this is an incredible display of men of conscience. Now it's not just conscience in principle, it's specific. It is the conscience that they will not be made to worship against their sincerely held beliefs. And that is of the utter conviction that there is one true and living God, and it is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they will bow to no other God. An incredible testimony that we have right here. The way they frame this, we don't have to think about it. We don't need to go and measure our words. We're not worried how this comes off. He may deliver us, he may not. Just know this, we're not going to serve your gods. Incredible statement. I hope that by the end we've got a little flavor of that with what we see from some of the people. We're not going to get a lot of names tonight, but there's a heritage there that goes on into the 17th century that we'll just begin to touch tonight by the time that we're done. Okay, Psalm 119, 130 on your notes. The entrance of thy words giveth light, it giveth understanding unto the simple. The entrance of thy words. This captures the theme of the Reformation men that have dominated our focus, those that were concerned with the scriptures in the vernacular language. If the common man cannot read the Bible, who is to tell him what it says and why should he believe them? And yet we have men like John Wycliffe, like those that followed him, coming down to Martin Luther, coming down, of course, to men like William Tyndale, whose passion it was to get the Word of God in front of people. And so we've covered a lot of this history from 1509. Let's go ahead and start this out. 1509, when King Henry VIII takes the throne. He doesn't die until 1546. 1546, his son, his one and only son that he finally got, at least legitimate son through, if you want to call it legitimate, but through all of his means and machinery, takes the throne, Edward VI, and he reigns for about 6-7 years, and he's off the throne. He dies early as a young man, 14 years old. And his elder sister, Mary, Bloody Queen Mary, takes the throne. Many Protestants scatter from England. They go over onto the continent. On the continent, of course, they've got safety, but they also introduced to different forms of this Protestant religion, this Protestant faith that they've been growing in, and yet only from the English side of it. And so that whenever they come back at Mary Tudor's death, Bloody Queen Mary dies, Elizabeth I takes the throne, 1554, and then she reigns up until her death in 1557, sorry. She reigns up until her death in 1603. And so in 1603, and that's really where we start tonight, 1603, Elizabeth dies and the Tudor monarch dynasty dies along with it because she never married. She never married. She has no heir. And she was not concerned with marrying. She didn't want the influence of a king. She didn't want the influence of a husband. She wanted to rule it, and she was quite effective. The British Empire, as it were, really began to take root in the period of time, in the Elizabethan era, and really planted all the seeds that became the British Empire in the coming centuries. During her reign, if you remember, we're going to do a little bit of review here from the last couple of weeks. The thing that dominated her thinking in terms of policy was unity. Unity. It had been political and religious turmoil in her nation. Everybody recognized her as the leader. Now, there was some argument about whether or not there was a more legitimate heir, but it's not like they wanted to have a new election and just find somebody to come along and elect somebody. It was going to be one of the monarch. It was going to be one of the ruling family. So what was the dividing factor? The dividing factor was religion. And the pendulum had swung wildly from Henry moving from Catholicism into Protestantism, not because he was a convicted reformer, but for his own personal political and his own indulgences. This is why he wanted to move it that way. However, those that were authentically wanting to move it in that direction were right there in place. And so Edward VI, that young man, comes to the throne, the boy king, and he swings it, the pendulum wild, I don't know if it's wildly, but probably wildly over into the Protestant side. And just as wildly to that side, or even more so, Mary comes to the throne, swings it wildly to the Catholic side, and carries out that awful repression and persecution of those that did not hold to Catholic doctrine. 300 plus martyrs of the Mary reign. When that ends, what's going to happen? And there's a lot of people that wonder, well, she chooses the Via Media. This is not in your notes, but it really is the way that she ruled, and that is the middle road. There's something in the middle. It's a compromise. Now, it's more Reformed than it is Catholic, and yet it holds to Catholic vestiges that many people were very uncomfortable with. Now, how are they going to deal with this? They've got some freedom to operate. They've got some freedom to worship. And yet, the act of conformity that Elizabeth enacts adopts the 39 articles as a doctrine of faith. It was Cranmer's -3. Really, it wasn't just -3, but it was minus some, add some in. And so it was a mixed bag. And yet, it was more Reformed than it was Catholic. It was mandated the use of Cranmer's Second Book of Common Prayer. Citizenship, membership, same thing. English citizenship, English church membership, both in the same thing. Uniformity of priestly vestments, that's the robes that erupted in that Vestarian controversy. The use of the bishop's Bible, this was her rejection, really, of the Geneva Bible. We spoke about this just a little bit. The exiles that fled from England and went over into Europe, went to several places, whether it was in Strasbourg, whether it was in Antwerp, whether it was in Geneva. Geneva particularly had an influence on men like John Knox, but other men like William Whittingham, which is listed there in your notes, who then saw the idea, or saw the use of now taking the work of Tyndale and of Coverdale and Matthews and updating it with some of the newer work that had been done in the Greek text. And there were new printers, and there were better printing methods. A man named Robert Stevens was an excellent printer that was really harried out of England, but was on the continent, was used by these people to try to print a new English Bible. And the English Bible that was produced from this translation work, and by the way, it was the first committee translation work done of an English text, and it was the Geneva Bible. It had some study notes. It was made smaller. It was intended for people to be able to get it into their hands and distribute it. That was its one intent. It was pitched towards or geared towards the common man. It was even dedicated to Queen Elizabeth. And yet, Queen Elizabeth didn't like that. It had some elements in it she wasn't particularly fond of. It didn't take an aggressive stance against those that had rebelled against monarchs, like the midwives of Egypt who rejected what the Pharaoh said and did what they wanted to do, like Josiah, who had his mother, or his grandmother really, Maacah, thrown off removed completely from where she was, and that didn't sit well with the queen. She didn't want that kind of thing in the margin, or that should be reflected on negatively, not positively, in the study notes. So she wasn't a big fan of the Geneva Bible, even despite the fact that it was dedicated to her. So the bishop's Bible was her idea, and this was from those church members, or from her own scholars, updating again the work of Tyndale. Yet it wasn't really received in England. The Geneva Bible found firm acceptation in England. It went through 80 editions of printing, whereas the bishop's Bible only went through about 17 or 18. The demand for it was overwhelming as compared to the bishop's Bible. And so this was a major factor, because this is now becoming the text that the Protestants of England are studying, are learning from, and are preaching. And among them that are preaching are those that have been to the continent. They've seen the Bible expounded, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. They've heard the preaching of Theodore Beza, John Calvin, and they desire to do that as well. And yet, what we find under the act of conformity are prescribed sermons. Elizabeth wants to make sure that the priestly class, the priests are on the same page. And so they're preaching the same sermon. It's a rotation of about a dozen sermons, something like that. So you kind of getting the same things, you're getting the same sermons, but you're never getting any more than that. There's no true exposition of teaching of the Scriptures. Well, what the the people that were really desiring to see the scriptures preached and taught did was to hold major meetings where they would preach one to another, particularly young preachers, so that they could learn from one another. They called this times of prophesying. It's not foretelling future, but simply foretelling God's word, which is what prophecy is at its essence. Elizabeth said, quit that. Stop it. She told her archbishop, you need to repress that. And he said, no, I like it. So she repressed him, okay? Didn't have him killed or anything, not like that. But he lost his job, a man of principle that wouldn't do that. But the whole idea was an educated priesthood, but these men that were desiring for them to expound the scriptures didn't want just an education. They wanted them educated as preachers, practicing expositors of God's word. So that's the tone of what happened in Elizabeth's England. And two factions grew out of this. The two factions that grow out of this, there's those who wish to press the reform further. That's who I've been discussing in this matter. Those that were doing the prophesying, that wanted to see the Catholic influences removed from the English church. They wanted to press the reform further towards the things that they had seen on the continent. And of course, they are wanting to purify the church. We know them as Puritans. Puritans. A little bit later, there are going to be those among the Puritans. So from within the Puritans, there's going to be a group that comes out of them. What do they want? They want to see the same thing. They want to see a purified church. They've only realized it's probably not going to happen from within the English church. So they separate. So what do we call them? Separatists. All right, pretty easy, separatists. So you got Puritans, you got separatists, and then of course you got your churchmen, your Anglican churchmen, your English churchmen. So that's the two factions that have grown out of it, to some degree in resistance, or to some degree just malcontent. We want to see this go further, and you've got all along the spectrum within this. Okay, so that sort of picks back up 1603. What's been happening to bring us to the place that we're going to have to replace Elizabeth, who's now off the throne. So in 1603, Elizabeth's ascension to the throne had been contested, you'll remember, by the grounds that there was one person that may have a more legitimate right to the throne. She did not, but some people had brought her forth, and that was Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots. Some said she held a more legitimate right to the throne. Now, the very fact that they said this did create some tension. Just to give you a little bit of a sense for it, Henry VIII had two sisters. One named Margaret, one named Mary. Keep that from happening. One named Mary. Down the line from Margaret is the line that comes into Mary, Queen of Scots. Of course, from Henry, we've got three different wives. We've got, well, more than three wives, but three prominent wives as far as those who bore children. And of course, Elizabeth comes from the marriage to Jane Seymour. Did I get that right? Not Jane Seymour. Catherine of Aragon. Help me out here. Anne Boleyn was right after her, because Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, bore Edward. That's right. You're like a killing me, Miss Julie. Thank you. So that's what we've got on Henry's side. So we've got a cousin over here that may have a more legitimate right. Well, of course, that was never affirmed, but there's a censor. There's that one that's out there during Elizabeth's reign. Maybe, just maybe, there's somebody out there who deserves the throne a little bit more than you. Now, what does that turn into? Of course, it turns into potential political intrigue. You have conspiracy theories, as it were. You know, maybe Mary Queen of Scots wants the throne. There is an effort, if you remember, by Philip II of Spain, who thinks, well, we'd like to get England back under the Catholic banner, back under the, the umbrella. And so one way to do that is to get Mary installed onto the throne, since Mary is still a good Catholic queen. And if we get her, they'll accept her as a legitimate right. So there's the machinations of, political intrigue, or maybe overt, battle to be taking place. But in 1567, this is your next blank there, 1567, just before her exile. And the reason she's taken into exile, she's arrested on the charges that she's been a part of treasonous plans to overthrow Elizabeth as queen and to be placed into the throne in England. Just before her exile, she gives birth to her only son. Now, Mary Queen of Scots was a bit of a romantic, and she made really poor choices on men, even in her marriages. She was married twice. Her second marriage was to a man named Lord Darnley. Really, his name is Henry Stuart. We might know it as the name Stuart. And they had one son who was born just before the plot that was hatched, and Mary's found guilty of treason and taken into exile. She's locked in the Tower. Essentially, she lives out her life there until she's eventually executed for even more accusations of treachery. But the child then is left to be raised in Scotland. The child is just a few months old, does not go with his mother. So his mother does not raise him in exile. He's actually raised in Scotland, which now provides him to be raised in a Protestant environment. So he's raised in an environment with reformer teachers, with Protestant influence, and he's got no real relationship with his mother. He's raised without her around. And so loyalties that he might feel or animosity towards Elizabeth, there's none of that with him. At least there doesn't appear to have been. And at Elizabeth's death, this young man, who of course not a young man any longer, he ascends to the throne since she has never married. And this man, we know, he was King James of the Sixth of Scotland, but we know him as King James the First of England. King James the First of England. Now the question on everybody's mind, at least all of these Puritan reformers' minds. Where is James going to fall on the issues? Is he going to rule like his mother? Doesn't seem to be possible because the Catholic influence of his mother Mary probably didn't have quite the impact. He was raised in a more reformed environment. Is he going to reign more like Elizabeth, who had wild political success by choosing that via media, to stay in the middle? No, to pull some of this, compromise with this. The main thing is keep unity and build a strong England with a strong church. Which way is he going to rule? Well, even as he's crossing the River Tweed, as it were, to go and ascend the throne in 1603, he's already getting approached with the questions. How are you going to handle this? And of course, the ones that are the most concerned about it are the Puritan reformers. They're the ones that have been experiencing what they would consider a repression because they haven't been able to really express their faith, live out the faith in the church and the administration of pastoring. The way they saw was biblical, the way they had witnessed it on the continent. Now, it's been 50 years, but that legacy, that tradition has stayed with so many of them. It really has, it has hardened into a pattern. It's a passionate desire. Well, a petition is presented to James I, to King James, and it is called the Millenary Petition. We go. Maybe it's millenary, whichever one it is. The reason it's called that is because it's presumed or it's said or it was boasted that 1,000 Protestants, 1,000 Puritan ministers had signed it. Now, 1,000 Protestant ministers, if you're a royal, if you're a monarch, we may think that, well, if they're royalty, then they're not too swayed by the opinion of the people. They are still, because the peace within their kingdom, the prosperity of their kingdom, is going to be influenced by the willingness of the people to follow them. It's not ideal, particularly in a situation like this, when James is coming from Scotland. He wants to steal Dale Carnegie's line. He wants to win friends and influence people. You don't want to come in necessarily with a bad, taste in everybody's mouth. You want to have good, loyal subjects, and so he wants to engage, and it's not just engage them as concerned subjects. James, for all of his faults, and he had some big ones, okay? He had some really big ones. For all of his faults, he was a keen theologian. He was a very smart individual. He had been schooled, and he had been schooled well as a young man. So when he takes the throne, let's don't get the wrong idea that somehow he's casual or just a novice when it comes to theological matters. He's deeply engaged in this. That he's not a moral man, but he is deeply engaged theologically. He is concerned for these things. He likes to discuss them. In some sense, he considers himself a man of faith, not in the sense that many of the Reformist Puritans would have considered, and yet his word is going to matter. So what do we do? All right, what do we do? These men are disputing clerical marriage. They're disputing having the cross put up, or really a crucifix in churches, the sign of the cross mandated at baptism, the use of rings in weddings, mandated priestly vestments, the rite of confirmation. There's a pretty good list of things that they have that they would like for James to relieve from them. Give those that want to do them the right to do them, but remove from us the conformity act. We don't want to be forced to do these things. So he summons a council, or he summons a conference. Let's back some of these up. And it's the Hampton Court Conference. And it's held January of 1604. So January 1604, so it's just been less than a year. It's not working. Now it's working. Y'all got to bear with me, okay? 1604, Hampton Court Conference in London. It's going to be held, and we're going to have a theological debate. We're going to hash these things out together. Now, get the breakdown of what we have here. We've got 20 Anglicans headed up by a man named Whitgift and another man named Bancroft, and this is going to be this is heavy hitters. 20 Anglican scholars, professors, so on and so forth. There are 4 Puritans here, so they are vastly outnumbered. Now, in some sense, that probably demographically captures it, the proportion. I don't know that for sure. Just saying there's a larger predominance of Anglicans, you might say, in England than there are of the Puritans. And yet, at this conference, it's going to be hard for these guys to really have a good, fair shake. Now, these 4 Puritans, 3 of which I've got listed right here, a man named Chatterton, a man named Thomas Spark, not the time to discuss these. But I did want to mention one of these, the head of this group, okay? Here's the head of this group, and his name is John Reynolds. That's on the test, okay? Make sure you get that. That's on the test. Absolutely, that's on the test. Love it when a teacher tells you what's going to be on the test. John Reynolds, and he's the spokesman for the group. Now, maybe more exactly it would be John Reynolds, but you find it spelled both ways. My friend Menachem would like to hear that because that's how he says Reynolds in his Hebrew accent when he speaks English, and he says that name, Reynolds. John Reynolds. Now, all of this is heavily slanted towards Anglicans and against the purifying reform. And it doesn't really appear, as much as James is open for some debate, it doesn't really appear that his mind is open to change. They go through the list thing by thing by thing by thing. And one after another, it's pretty clear James is rigidly against essentially all the requests for your Puritan reform. It's not looking good at all. And it doesn't. It never really relents. You see, back in Scotland, James had been raised in a reformed environment, but the Presbyterians, which had a major influence in Scotland because of John Knox, under the influence of John Calvin, the Presbyterians weren't exactly soft men. They didn't back up for much of anything. And they had let James know when he was king of Scotland that Jesus is the head of the church. They accepted no other head of the church. Andrew Melville, one Presbyterian, called James to his face God's silly vassal. He said, in all things pertaining to rule, we will obey. But in all things pertaining to the church, Jesus Christ alone is head, and we will not obey you. In his presence, they said this. These were not men of kind of the soft material, all right? They were hard men of the faith. They had earned it. They had paid their dues, and they had watched people who had paid dearly for their faith, and they were not going to back up when it came to matters of conscience. In the end, Puritans are essentially dismissed from the conference. But late in the second day, and it's kind of funny, you can hear the story told a variety of ways because this is a very influential conference for this reason and really for this reason alone. Now, overall, it's major because it let everybody know this is how James is going to rule. But by the end of it, one other request, and some tell the story as though, do you have anything else? Is that it? Everything else has been summarily dismissed. And John Reynolds, if the story, the way I've kind of been told and read about it is true, basically says, well, there is one other thing. There's one other thing. We would like to see the Bible updated into with the addition of some text, with the understanding of languages, some opportunities to better the translations that we have. We would like to see an updated translation of the English Bible. James says, Now that doesn't sound too bad. Now, why would James think that doesn't sound too bad? Now, consider the Bishop's Bible under Elizabeth had been translated, but it's been 50 years since that was translated. The Geneva Bible around the same time has been translated. Both have probably seen some updates. I know the Geneva had seen some updates as few as 5 years prior to this, but nothing fresh or new to reflect some of the new scholarship in the languages, some of the manuscripts that had come to light, some of the things that said, hey, we ought to attend to this. What should we do about it? Well, James hears the request, and of course, here's an opportunity. Not to be moved doctrinally. As a matter of fact, it's a chance to kind of curtail what he did like in the Geneva Bible. Perhaps then instill his name on something that might be accepted on both sides of the aisle, as it were. Now, it did not go that well to start with. Eventually, it became ensconced. And of course, the translation that we're referring to, did it turn off? It did. We're back. The translation that we're referring to is the King James Version of the Bible. King James Version of the Bible. This is a massive, massive decision that is made. And it may feel like, well, I thought everything else, we already had English translations and so on. But this becomes an incredibly influential work, not only in terms of biblical scholarship, but also in culture. Because the language of the King James text codifies much of the growth and development of the English language to that point, and also reflects growing doctrinal issues to that point. You see, there were some things like the word for church. Whenever Tyndale was translating, if you said church, when you said the words church, here's what everybody thought. Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholic Church. It's the church. So when you came to a place where the word ecclesia in Greek is found, which means church, but really it's in very literal terms the assembly of the called out ones. We've said the ones called out to come together. And it's always been the idea in the Greek language about those that were called out to come together, an assembly for that purpose. And so when Tyndale had come to that place, he didn't really want to give that doctrinal nod to the Catholics, and so he had translated it with congregation. That's what it is. It is in its strict literal terms the congregation, and yet probably didn't reflect accurately the true import of the word. Now we would call that dynamic translation, not formal equivalence, but dynamic equivalence. All that means is we take the sense of the word sometimes instead of the very formal, strict, literal translation of the word. Well, whenever this is done, much of what Tyndale, and not just Tyndale, but others on one side, and much of what the Catholics and Anglicans have done on the other side, is brought all together under this group of translators, which goes through, and we'll not spend a lot of time on this, we'll go back through this at some point when we talk about translation, but it goes through rigorous process of translation. Ultimately, of course, it is the publishing first begins in 1611. There's not actually a standard text that was written and then that was put together and then goes from there, and it's why you never actually see an authorization, interestingly enough. It's called the Authorized Version, the King James Authorized Version, but there's never actually a public official act that authorizes the text. So it's interesting some of the history behind it. It went through a lot of printing errors. Some of them were glaring, some of them were inexplicable. Some of them were printers who were mad at the people who weren't paying them for their printing, so they put little things in the text. It's an incredible history. I can point you to some really cool texts if you want to look at them. One by Gordon Campbell called Bible, the history of the King James Bible. Incredibly insightful, tons of information about this story. Tells it in a wonderful way. You may not agree with all of his conclusions, but it is an incredible story because of its impact on culture, society, and this idea that there's room for discussion, that there's room to come and view it, and the desire to bring it into the table of the modern man. If you have a copy of the King James Bible that has the preface at the beginning, this one right here does not have one. My big preaching Bible actually has one. It has a preface to the King James, preface to the reader. And if you look at it, it's pretty lengthy. I'm going to say it's an interesting read, okay? But there's parts of it that are really interesting. but you get the legacy of the translators themselves. You get the sense of it. And these were Anglican and Puritans. You got a mixture of these coming together on this. And this really shapes the church for years to come. And because of the growth of the English language, and because of the growth of the American influence, it's difficult to really quantify the impact that this translation had really in our world, in church history. It's an incredible story. It sounds like maybe I'm overstating it. Maybe I am, but there's some that would say I'm not stating it broadly enough. That being said, I do want to finish with just a couple of thoughts. Despite the acquiescence on the translation, Puritans broadly felt that the hope for throwing off what they call the rooks of popery were beyond hope. Now some remained, okay, some remained. And throughout the 17th century, they persisted. The English Puritans. And we know the name Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon is born a century too late, really, to be considered a Puritan. And yet that's where his most profound influences come from, is from the Puritans. And these men were dedicated to soundness in the Scriptures, to preaching, teaching, and living the Scriptures. That's what defined them the most. But underneath all that, of course, was the dedication to live out the conscience that God had given in worshiping the Lord. That the Puritans have gotten a pretty bad name as, dour, sour, mean. One person described Puritans as the belief, they call Puritanism the fear that somebody somewhere might be happy. Okay, that's what it means to be a Puritan, that you walk around afraid that somebody somewhere might be happy and you're against people being happy. Well, that's not the truth at all. You can read some of the writings and that's not the case. Some of the names I've listed here you might recognize: William Perkins, Richard Sibbes, A Bruised Reed, if you ever want to read something that's just incredible work. And Richard Sibbes was one of the original Puritans. John Owen wrote extensively, voluminous writings from some of these men. And John Bunyan. Anybody know why we know the name John Bunyan? What is it? Pilgrim's Progress. Yes, Pilgrim's Progress. John Bunyan is one of these English Puritans. We may do a little bit more in the life of John Bunyan just to sort of encapsulate those. Not tonight, of course. 1604 is when this translation is done, of course, or when it's approved. 1611 is when it's completed. Goes through, some versions, but by that time, or some updates, make sure the printing errors are gotten out of it. And of course, you've had spelling and you've had punctuation that have altered throughout the, through the evolution of the English language. Nonetheless, 1611 is when that sort of anchors. But by 1620, there were a group of people who had decided it's hopeless. There's no reason to think that this is ever going to change. So September the 6th, 1620, a group of separatist Puritans sailed from London in search of a place where liberty of conscience and worship were a reality. They had a Geneva Bible in their hands, okay? King James only been published for about 9 years. Geneva Bible was still the Bible of those separatists and Puritans. Matter of fact, the Geneva Bible is believed to have been with Sir Francis Drake when it circumnavigated the globe. That might have been the first Bible to circumnavigate the globe. That being said, they landed originally in the New World at Cape Cod on November the 11th, 1620. 5 weeks later, on December 18th, 1620, they finally found the place where they were going to set up shop. They landed in a place that we know as, anybody know what it's called? New England had Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock. Oh, that's a great guess. Plymouth Rock. So who are we talking about right here? Pilgrims. Plymouth Rock. William Bradford. Miles Standish. They had Bibles in their hands. They had a heart for liberty. It's what they desired. It's why they came to this nation. Now, by no means would I suggest historically that this is, the only influence that brought about the liberties of the New World. And yet what we find here is a part of that continuing stream of those who were coming to this new world, and among them was this desire to see the gospel unshackled. To live in a world where you could speak the gospel of Jesus Christ according to your conscience without fear of threat. And I cannot help but be struck by the fact that I'm talking about this tonight, when probably the most high-profile killing of an American Christian I know in my lifetime has taken place. Like I said, I don't intend to get political, but I can't help but notice someone who gave voice to the other side repeatedly. You may or may not follow the guy's work. And I'll just tell you this personally. I was not a big fan of Charlie Kirk for several years. And then I noticed a change in his demeanor. I noticed a change in his attitude. He handled people differently. Several years ago, I noticed that. And into that little bit of research I did, I found not only a change in his tone, but I found a change in the things that he said. Because he began to reflect on the change that Jesus Christ had made in his life when he gave his life to the Lord. And his message politically was very similar. His message in terms of faith took on a whole new aspect. And yet his demeanor was very, very different after that. He never backed up, but he engaged. And he engaged openly. He engaged what I thought was genuinely. And yet in this nation, we still realize that liberty of conscience cannot be taken for granted. It cannot be taken for granted. And it should not be easily dispensed with. Because what we're talking about from 420 years ago, less than 405 years ago, when those pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, was that desire to see the gospel unshackled, to see God's word unfettered by those that would tyrannize its message. And all I can say is, as upset as I want to get on a day like this, when you watch something like that, when you hear about something like that, all I can say is, this is not a new fight. It's not a new fight. Let's don't adapt our ways. Let's remain faithful to the cause that people like this remain faithful to, which is that the word of God will not return void. Continue to stand on it. Be unyielding with it. Persist. Persist in your faith. Persist in your message. Persist in your tone. Persist in your approach. Persist in being authentic with those who vehemently disagree with you. That's the legacy of what we have. It's the legacy of those that asked for the King James Bible, the King James translation, to be undertaken at all. It's the same legacy of those that said, we're going to take the message and we're going to find a place where we can preach it without fear of reprisal. So I just simply say, persist. Persist. Lord, I thank you that in a sense we do gather without fear tonight. I didn't think about my own safety coming in here. And yet we can't help but at least realize that things like this bring it to our minds. We think about what it is to fear for your message and fear for the faith that you proclaim. And yet I realize that I'm not alone here. There's others here who would stand boldly, and not to try to tear down the people that you came to die for, or to preach the gospel faithfully. And may we take our place among those who may have to stand for the faith. Stand boldly. Stand steadfastly. I do pray for Charlie Kirk's family. I pray that you'll give them special comfort. May they see the impact that a husband and a father made. I pray that those kids will be able to grow and understand the legacy of the father, who will be very limited in what he can do directly with them. But Lord, I pray that his legacy will be enduring with them. And I pray for those that are impacted in his organization and those that he gave his message proudly to. And I thank you that in this I have heard repeatedly since his death the gospel that he confessed, proclaimed again and again and again. And I thank you that has been given more of a voice because of this. May your gospel never be silenced, and may it never be silenced on our lips either. We sure thank you for your love for us, your kindness to us, and the legacy that we have as Americans. In Jesus' name, amen.